Seems perfect. And welcome to today's session. I have the honors of introducing our guest today. David Bade studied linguistics at the University of Illinois in the 1970s and received a degree in library science from the same university in 1992. During a temporary job cataloging books for the Native American Law Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico, he realized that as a cataloger in the library, he could pursue his own studies while devoting his working life to the service of scholars in search of the world beyond English. From 1979 to the present, he has worked for a number of university libraries, cataloging books in numerous languages of Africa, Central and Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe. In 2004, he moved back to his family's farm, where the hidden hand takes all his money away and gives it to the rich. Since reading Roy Harris in 2002, he has focused much of his attention on the philosophy of language and communication that underwrites nearly all theory in the fields of library and information science. He's currently working on 3 projects. Number 1, a study of Monty Roberts' work on communication among and with horses in light of Talbot J. Taylor's writings on the acquisition of language by children and apes. So the second project, an examination of the cataloging of monographs in the languages of Southeast Asia, which reveals the extent to which policy decisions have led to pervasive illiteracy in most US research libraries. And the third project, lambing season. I now give over to David Bade. Thank you.
Okay. It was pretty hard to answer Sinfri's request, because it's kind of hard to put all 3 of these projects in the same paper, but I'll try and see how we go. So I've also got to read this, because if I try to talk off the top of my head, I'm afraid we'll go nowhere. So Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy once made a remark to the effect that the only truth that you can know is the one that you've lived. Everything else is just talking about it. When Sinfri asked me if I would participate in this forum, he indicated that he would like me to speak about how I integrated my life as a librarian, a linguist, and a shepherd. My immediate response was, who on earth, or who at least among the forum's attendees, would want to sit and listen to me talk about librarianship or cleaning out the barn? What has that to do with decolonial linguistics? So I begin by saying that it has precisely this to do with linguistics. I have spent my life as a scholar and as a librarian oriented largely by my interest in learning what the rest of the world has to say. I have not sought to understand and explain the world according to theories learned in school, but to judge those theories by the world that I know through my encounters with that world. It is in the pasture and the barn that I meet a world that is not a product of my language and my imagination. It is in the library that I find your books and read them when I have time. It is my pleasure and my privilege to gather your publications, and I have accepted it as my responsibility to share what you have written as best I can with other readers who come to the library in search of your thoughts and ideas. How that communication takes place has been a major focus of my own research for the past 25 years. How it is that working in libraries and raising cattle, sheep, and a daughter provided a critical perspective on linguistic theory is what I shall try to outline in my remarks to follow. My ultimate objective is to suggest that if MIT and Harvard can ignore the world that is not in English and declare that their orientation towards the language is the only rational approach, while elaborating theories that are the modern equivalent of counting angels on the head of a pin, then we all desperately need to find those voices that will connect us with reality and our responsibilities towards that reality. If you will allow the expansion of the phrase, that is how I see my own work as an example of decolonial linguistics, even if it comes from a completely different world than your perspectives. As a child, I dreamt of traveling and speaking to everyone everywhere I went in their own language. That never happened. At 15, I went with a Cuban Pentecostal missionary to northern Mexico. I spoke Spanish, though not at all well, and converted no one. Instead, I was the one who was converted. I fell madly in love with Mexico and its people. It was that trip, more than anything else, that gave me my own orientation towards the world and theory. A few years later, a professor remarked in class one day that perhaps the world was not what we had been told it was. Perhaps it was something far more wonderful than we could ever imagine. And so before I turned 20, I had abandoned my plans to become a missionary and became a student. Instead of preaching and teaching, I embarked on a life of reading and listening and learning. Yet here I am speaking to you. I've chosen to address directly the dilemma of preaching and teaching in a world of learning. The main occupational hazards of the intellectual are the arrogant authoritarianism of I talk, you listen, and the cloud cuckoo land theorist dreaming away in his or her ivory tower. These two failures of communication haunt every effort of teaching and intellectual debate, my own and everyone else's. That this is a matter of language at both of these extremes is easy to see. The discourse of science, and therefore the scientist as the sole voice of knowledge, on the one hand, and an engagement in theory building and intellectual debate that have absolutely no significance for the world in which we and our children and their children must learn to live. As a student of linguistics in the 1970s, I was dumbfounded, not only the extent to which theory was developed on the basis of English alone and then applied to other languages, but also the proliferation of theories that were all impervious to arguments from the real world of language. And then with Chomsky's Pisa lectures, that was 1979, I witnessed the mass conversion of linguists in response to the latest pastoral epistle of Mr. Chomsky. I had been told rather condescendingly that religious people were incapable of intellectual curiosity and unwilling to acknowledge that the force of intellectual argument. Yet here were linguists flocking to the altar like Pentecostal converts. It was clear to me then, I think I was 20 years old in 1979, that the structures of authority and belief were even more pronounced in the university than I had ever met in churches. We argued a lot in churches. I assume that many of you have the same experience. But in the university, all I saw was herd following leaders. I really was astounded as a young man at what I saw in the universities. It wasn't at all what I'd been told. In those days, I was especially struck by Chomsky's attitude that all one needs to study language is to look closely at the English language. I was studying Palestinian Arabic, Chinese, Croatian, Biblical Hebrew, Japanese, Khmer, Russian, and Spanish, all as an undergraduate, while dreaming of studying Burmese, Mongolian, Tibetan, languages they didn't teach at U of I, and all the other languages of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, past and present, as well as speaking in tongues in my church. A linguistics based on English only, I considered a criminal enterprise. Indeed, a monstrous crime against humanity. But I could not argue with one point. If there were a universal grammar that underlay all languages, then theoretically one should be able to discover it and describe it, no matter what language and no matter how many or how few languages one investigated. On this matter of a linguistics based on English only, Talbot J. Taylor made a marvelous critique in a book review published in 1995. In his review, he praised the Encyclopedia of Language and Linguistics for including authors from 75 countries. In his final paragraph, he writes this, quote, I am myself an American linguist, need to be told at this particular time that American linguistics is not simply another expression for linguistics. Just as at an earlier time, European grammarians needed to be told that Latin grammar is not a synonym for grammar. It was the first descriptive grammars of the Native American languages, grammars which struggled to be independent of the Latinizing paradigm, that were finally able to effect this therapeutic transformation on the grammarian's picture of language structure, end quote. So here we see the core issue clearly. It is only by paying attention to those other languages, listening to the voices of those others, that the American linguist and the English-only theorist will confront the non-universality of English and the differences with which speakers around the globe exuberantly or carefully express themselves. So now let me jump ahead 30 years to that moment when I realized what was wrong with Chomskyan linguistics. This was under the influence of my discovery of Roy Harris. Chomsky never even looked at English, much less any other language. All it takes to realize that, and it took me 30 years to see what was plain as day, is to look at Chomsky's own examples in his published writings. So let me read a few of Chomsky's English upon which universal grammar is based. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. The man hit the ball. What do you think that Mary fixed? How did John wonder what Mary fixed? John believes sincerely that Mary is clever. John wants to go. John wants Bill to go. John tries Bill to win. Now that last example, Chomsky's language organ apparently produced in order to support his argument that it is a syntactic string that no one's language organ produces. Presumably, the argument does not apply to linguists whose language organs generate this kind of nonsense all the time. In fact, Chomsky writes the first example sentence quoted above in The Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory in 1955, again in the 1956 paper, Three Models for the Description of Language, and for a third time in Syntactic Structures in 1957. Moreover, searching that phrase today using Google indicates that Chomsky's grammatical, though nonsensical, colorless green ideas sleep furiously appears 47,300 times in documents on the internet. Although disguised as John, Bill, and Mary, Chomsky never goes beyond Dick, Jane, and Sally. For those of you who didn't grow up in 1930s to 1960s United States, I can explain that later. Language and life are hitting, wanting, winning, and balls all the way. In Chomsky's English, there is no hint of ethnicity, race, religion, poverty, joy, old age, sickness, or death, much less Buddhism. Nor is there any hint of communication, of winter and summer, of children, or of animals. The only time Chomsky ever comes close to admitting the real world is in that famous phrase repeated 47,303 times now, colorless. Chomsky's English is colorless, yet it is green, tinged with envy, and it sleeps furiously. The envious middle-class white man's troubled unconscious. In Chomsky's linguistics, we find the real world abolished through envious repression, replaced by the ideological world of Dick, Jane, and Sally. In contrast to his linguistics, Chomsky's political writings are the furious repudiation of that colorless green intellectual sleep that is required for the promotion of the ideal English speaker listener in a homogeneous speech community upon which his linguistics is based. His political writings vehemently criticize the United States precisely because his linguistics is the pure expression of the American ideology of the melting pot, the perfectly homogeneous community in rigid conformity with its inherited biological rules for the production of social order. Anyone who looks at real English will have to consider the world-shaking and world-making significance of English in the real world. Here, I offer a few instances of the language that made me and those who made it. Probably too many instances, but it's really hard sometimes to stop. Okay. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. That's from the King James Bible. Therefore, get up with determination and fight. That's from the Bhagavad-Gita. Tat tvamasi. That's from the Chandogya Upanishad. For a boy who is supposed to be so smart, you sure are stupid. That's what my dad said. Knowledge is power. Thomas Hobbes. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. Frederick Douglass. Love needs reality. Simone Weil. Here's one of my favorites, my dearly beloved Yoko Ono. The odds of not meeting in this life are so great that every meeting is like a miracle. It's a wonder that we don't make love to every single person we meet. That was one of the great, great words directed to me when I was 18. I read that on a liner notes to one of her records, and it really turned my whole life around. Another significant moment was when my head of the department in my library said to me in his office, "Get out of here." It was sort of the end of my career. And then another one, my wife and I said to each other, "I do." Now, these are all examples of real language, the language that has made me who I am, how I think, and how I live. Voices that speak across millennia. Tattvamasi may appear to some of you to be a Sanskrit phrase if I didn't butcher it too badly, which it is, but it is also in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I repeat it often, even though I don't know Sanskrit. So I have to consider it good English as well, just like Shatsi, Amigo, Jihad, Kung Fu. To these linguistic life changes that have had immense significance for me, we might add the following for many others. In a country well governed, poverty is something to be ashamed of. Confucius. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's every Anglophone Muslim, I assume. Here I stand, I can do no other. Martin Luther. I think, therefore I am. Descartes. Let him eat cake. Marie Antoinette. Give me liberty or give me death. Patrick Henry. Workers of the world, unite. The Communist Manifesto. Change the world, it needs it. Somebody, maybe everybody says that. And then make America great again. The significance of each of these sentences is determined by who says, hears, writes, or reads it, when, where, and why. Notice also that a lot of that comes from some other language. Although once again, I cannot provide a reference, when I asked Roy Harris, he suggested that Michael Toulon was the one who made the remark, what linguists often forget is that people sometimes fall in love. Yet before I had read anything by Michael Toulon or Roy Harris, Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy had blown me away, throwing me forever outside the theoretical confines of the standard theory, with his discussion of how language establishes relationships, using as his primary example those two little words, I do. Rosenstock-Huessy was not simply making a comment on speech act theory, an example of a performative verb. He was saying that language brings you and another person into a relationship that, in the case of I do, alters not just one's own life, but that of another. It establishes not just one relationship, but multiple relationships, backwards through the past, as well as forward into the future, with kinship ties. And that by establishing such relationship, it reveals its political origin. I do has the power to bring together people of different and perhaps antagonistic genders, families, classes, castes, nations, races, and religion. If you followed this far, you should be able to see how a Chomskyan examination of I do, noun plus verb, does not get anywhere near language as a socially responsible act of political commitment and relationship. To even think of language in terms of the rules of grammar, or of a language, or of the English language, is to completely miss everything that is vital and necessary about language. One can easily pursue this line of thinking to the conclusion. The idea that universal grammar underlies language is a theoretical idea that prohibits any relationship between language and one, communication, two, social relationships, and three, political realities. So having extricated myself from the theoretical fictions and restrictions of the standard theory, I could turn my attention south and east to studying all those real languages rather than universal grammar. And then one day, Sinfrey Meconi informed me that all those real languages of Africa were the creation of Protestant Catholic missionaries and colonial administrators. Sinfrey's studies of the politics of colonial linguistics in Africa brings me back to Chomsky's remarks in Language and Responsibility about science and linguistics as a science in relation to the political realm, namely that scientific theory has no political dimension. Linguistic theory has no connection whatsoever with political matters, however much scientists and linguists themselves may devote their energies to political issues. Language is a product of the language organ, and science the product of the science organ. No political origin, no political implications for language or science, both of these being bodily excretions like saliva and urine. Ew. It is this conception of language and science being the products of some internal organs, and moreover organs whose operations are described as the rule-governed generation of particular kinds of objects in the biological world, which all my experience in the library revealed to be unacceptable precisely because of its denial of the political dimensions of language. For me, the library was the place where all the voices of the world were gathered together so that they could all participate in our conversations about who we are and what we should do. The library is an institutional effort to bring about encounters across time, space, language, and culture. My task as a librarian has always been to ensure that each of those authors, writing in their various languages, would be integrated into the collection in such a manner as to promote their discovery and study by students and scholars. I had to assume that they each had something to say, and that there were people like myself who did want to learn what they had to say. Yet the orientation and attitudes I found among library managers and professors of library science was that we are simply managing information. Neither authors nor readers were relevant to our work, which was understood to be a technical operation of cataloging, classification, warehousing, archiving, storage and retrieval, managing publishers' contracts, etc. Instead of Rosenstock-Huess's insistence that people speak because they have something to say, library science and library management offer us information considered as something independent of its makers and readers in a process in which both are irrelevant. Into that situation, the once-upon-a-time linguistics student struggled to make sense of his responsibilities to the authors of the books and to the library's readers. I was thrilled to be given the responsibility to ensure that those books in African and Asian languages would be made available for anyone who wanted to read them. I very quickly realized my own limitations, and it did not take me long to see that the problems that I had were the same as those at probably every other research library in the United States and the world. And most of us librarians did and continue to do what is perhaps the most responsible action we can take. We wait for someone else to catalog those books, someone who can actually read them well enough to have something to say about them. We keep searching for those books in our shared library databases, and when someone else provides a record, we copy it and feel relieved that the work has been accomplished. Yet I knew that many of those records were being deliberately input by persons who did not know what they were doing, who couldn't read what they were cataloging, but who were being ordered to do it anyway by library administrators. The idea had occurred to some library manager who considered him or herself technologically savvy, that his staff could enter an incomplete and erroneous record and wait for someone else to fix it, to fill it out and correct its errors and omissions. And then they could just download that corrected record for the library to use. We call that cooperative cataloging. It's a splendid idea, isn't it? Except that everyone was doing the same thing. Noun phrase, every library was waiting for someone else to complete the work and give it back to us perfect. Noun phrase added to verb phrase, and we've produced language. Fill in the blanks of an empty computer template, complete it with default settings, we have access to information. Unfortunately, in that world, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, and they are not the only ones to do so. Like medieval alchemists, we stick fool's gold into our computers and expect the system to turn it back to us as pure gold. There is no communication involved at all. In 2002, as I struggled with this ideological, technical, and linguistic situation in the library, I sat down and read Roy Harris for the first time. I immediately grasped what he was arguing in The Language Machine because I was living in the innermost circle of that hell. Instead of a theoretical linguistics that denied the political and ethical dimensions of speaking and writing before anything could even be said or written, here was a theory of language that made everything in my library world come alive. What I was up against in the library was the institutional incarnation of the language machine, the bureaucratic and technological production and circulation of language that was absolutely meaningless and useless. Harris's discussion of Saussure's blank, bold talking heads, speech machines with no gender, no age, no class, no religion, no desires, no hopes, no fears, no education, no political goals, no personality at all, and nothing to say, seemed to me to be a profound critique not only of Saussure and Chomsky, but of scholarly communication as understood by information scientists and librarians. With my first paper drawing on Harris's ideas, the library administration at the University of Chicago sought to terminate my employment because of that paper. I had been ordered not to let anyone read it. But someone did read it and wrote to the Library of Congress about it, and someone there wrote to my employer, and the associate provost at the university eventually ruled in my favor on the grounds that the University of Chicago actually does encourage research and publication. I was very glad to hear that. But in the meantime, before that judgment came down, I moved back to the farm, fully expecting to be disemployed at any moment. Exercising one's academic freedom, that is to say, one's freedom of speech, can be costly. That is how at 46 years old, I suddenly became a cowherd like Krishna and chose to remain one. Life with cattle, sheep, and goats is far more rewarding than life in a university bureaucracy. Like Krishna, I dance with a peacock, play with calves, and wade in the river. Like Simone Weil, I need that reality because I love it. If speaking in the library can be absurd on the one hand or end your career on the other, living both of those realities concurrently made it impossible for me to think of linguistics as though I were in an ivory tower, to elaborate theory as though it had absolutely nothing to do with the social and political realities within which we live. Speaking to cattle, sheep, and foxes in the barn, however, took me in entirely unexpected directions. Language doesn't make communication possible. Rather, the desire for communication makes language possible. Cattle, horses, pigs, and foxes do not speak English or the universal grammar of the standard theory, much less read about it. Yet to the attentive cowherd, they speak volumes. The peacock, for instance, has to lead the dance. Information science was more or less born with Norbert Wiener's book, Cybernetics, Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. And it should be no surprise that in information science, communication and control are coupled, not only in the animal and the machine, but in theory as well. In the library world, it demonstrated control over the materials in the library is uncritically assumed to foster scholarly communication. Just as in orthodox linguistics, communication is assumed to be made possible by the proper functioning of the language organ, or even is nothing but the proper functioning of the language organ. There are no relationships of freedom nor of responsibility, only relationships of obedience and necessity, the inevitable predictability of mechanical operations. But the world isn't like that at all, not in the library, not in the pasture, not in the barn. I have on occasion heard professors remark that English is the language of science, and it alone suffices, and even that the whole world looks to the United States for scientific leadership, so we need not concern ourselves with those un-American voices, etc. Yet the science of Harvard and MIT gives us a language organ. In my work as a librarian, I have come to understand that no one can rely on the authority of science, of English scholarship, and American theory. What the folks in Ulaanbaatar, Mumbai, and Nouakchott have to say cannot be any worse than what comes out of MIT. Just as linguists of an earlier day needed to pay attention to Native American languages in order to see their own theoretical blindness, so today linguists need to look for those voices not rendered sterile by adherence to American ideologies of language. Hence this forum. The connections that are often made between communication and control present us with that issue which is at the very core of Roy Harris's critique of linguistic theory and philosophy of language as we generally hear it. MIT, Chomsky, the standard theory, etc. The freedom and responsibility of the language maker, both as speaker and writer and as hearer and reader. And here I would like to draw back to a remark by Edward Said that I really love. Quote, "There is, after all, a profound difference between the will to understand for purposes of coexistence and humanistic enlargement of horizons, and the will to dominate for the purposes of control and external enlargement of horizons, and the will to dominate for the purposes of control and external domination." That's from the introduction to the 25th anniversary edition of Orientalism. When communication is understood as a practice following a will to dominate for the purposes of control, we are led to cybernetics, information theory, library science, the standard theory in linguistics, atomic physics, and some all too common approaches to prayer. But that is not all. We are led directly to violence. And at this point, I would like to close with two short comments and then open the forum up for a more conversational approach than the I talk, you listen style that you've had to suffer these last few minutes. The first closing remark concerns Byung-Chul Han's book, What is Power? Here and now, I wish only to point out that in his conclusion to that book, Han suggests that it is naming that gives us power. And that by giving ourselves no name, we may be able to give ourselves to the world in acts that will not involve the exercise of power and violence. I don't know what all follows from that, but I was really profoundly moved by that conclusion to his book. And my final remark concerns the horse trainer Monty Roberts and his understanding of establishing relations of communication among horses. Communication among horses, Roberts claims, always involves establishing relations of trust. And violence always destroys trust. Roberts has developed a way of working with horses, communicating with them in body language, movements, and gestures that seeks to talk them into cooperating with the trainer in doing things that both the horse and the trainer will enjoy. Unlike traditional horse training methods, he does not try to dominate or control the horse. He seeks to communicate to the horse that he, the trainer, can be trusted and that they can do things together for their mutual enjoyment. In that world, violence is anathema. The horses won't stand for it, and neither will Monty Roberts. In other words, with love and devotion and all the right moves, Roberts gets his horses to say, I do. That's it. Sinfrey?
Thank you very much. I think everyone can now understand why I thought inviting you would be very helpful.
You're muted. Okay.
Yes. I think let's give David, let's clap for David.
Thank you.
I have a couple of issues that I want to discuss with you, David. The first one is just more informative before we get into a discussion. Some of the members of the forum may know something about Chomsky, etc., but have hardly read any material about Roy Harris because of the skewed nature in which linguistic theories and practices and if you are ostracized from the discipline of linguistics, whatever you say, it doesn't really matter. So Roy Harris may not be very widely known. So can you just give us a bit of a background about who Roy Harris was, what his main ideas were, for example? I only got to know more about Roy Harris when I had left the University of Cape Town. Even though at the University of Cape Town, there was Nigel Love who was working on Roy Harris and integrationism. I just thought he was just doing some stuff on language and philosophy that had no relevance to what I was talking about. It was only after I had left Cape Town that I discovered that, no, this guy called Nigel Love seems to be talking things which are of interest. So why don't you give us some more information about who this guy called Roy Harris is and what you think his impact is on your way of thinking about linguistics?
Well, I'll back up. I'll back up just a minute too. When I studied linguistics in 1970s, it was with Robert Lees, one of Chomsky's first students, and Lees founded the department at U of I, and so he hired people there who knew Chomsky and linguistics, but they knew nothing else. And when I studied linguistics, every other approach to language prior to Chomsky was dismissed as irrelevant. And, the debate was whether to argue that we'd had a scientific revolution in linguistics and everything before Chomsky was now pre-scientific. So we didn't need to know anything about the history of linguistics. Now, Raj Kachru taught me the history of linguistics in a class, so he would probably object to that statement. But pretty much, the linguists in the 1970s at the University of Illinois, where I studied, they didn't know the history of linguistics. They didn't know anything that wasn't Chomsky. And we were all just taught Chomsky. Well, at that time, of course, it was generative grammar. Chomsky's students who were doing something that Chomsky later squashed, but there was no awareness of any other approach in linguistics. And so when I looked at Rosenstock-Huessie's books and Roy Harris's books, when I saw them in bookstores or the library, I paid no attention to them because they were speaking a language that had nothing to do with generative transformational grammar. I didn't realize there could be anything valuable there. But it was when I first sat down to read Eugen Rosenstock-Huessie, and when I first came to the University of Chicago in '95, that I realized he's really hard to understand because of my own limited background in linguistics. But his basic idea was that people speak because they have something to say, and therefore language has a political origin. Well, that is just totally unlike Chomsky linguistics, as far from that as you can get. But when I read Roy Harris then in 2002, I realized Harris and Rosenstock-Huessie were starting at the same place. Language is a political act. It has political origins. It matters. It establishes, and it is not just something abstract structures that the mind generates for no reason whatsoever. Now that means that Harris's books address none of the questions that Chomsky addresses. There is nothing in any of Harris's books that responds to anything like the separate domains of linguistic theory that we have in our classes: syntax, phonology, semantics. I mean, Harris does speak about meaning and semantics, but he does not speak about it in terms of generative semantics or the semantic component or any of this kind of theoretical ideas. Harris is a philosopher. He is a thinker with a profound sense of our political responsibility. So you can't read Harris looking for an analysis of linguistic artifacts. You read Harris to understand why people speak, why there is language, what it means that we speak to each other. It is a completely different approach to language that has a completely different set of orienting questions. I find it wonderful.
Okay. My first encounter with Chomsky was when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Ghana. And what I couldn't understand, but now I partially do, was that in the halls of residence, there was lots of mosquitoes and all that, and we didn't have electricity and all that. But we would spend nights trying to draw these tree diagrams. And I remember asking a friend of mine, what do tree diagrams have to do with these mosquitoes? I couldn't see the connection between what the notions of language that they were teaching us in linguistics and the struggles that we were faced with. That's where sociolinguistics came very interesting to me, because I could at least relate to it. I couldn't understand what they were talking about. And let me move on to the other point that you make, which I've always found very interesting because of your experience. You make the point that from your perspective, and I see where you're coming from, that language is the product of communication. So if that is the case, if language is the product of communication and it's not language that produces communication, when you are talking to your horses, the language of the way you communicate with horses will be different from the way you communicate, let's say, with your pigs and your goats, for example. So are there different varieties of language depending on the species, on the animals that you are interacting with on your farm?
Well, to be honest, my animals don't really pay much attention to me unless I'm carried away. Monty Roberts has actually written a book where he does it's like a book of sign language, and he shows what movements mean what amongst horses. So if they move their head this way or that way, if they walk a certain way, things like at a certain point they will poop, and it actually signifies something to in the particular kinds of relationship when a horse has been banished from the herd for bad behavior. Young boy horses often.
Yes.
And when they want to get back in, because of obviously banished from the herd means death. So they want back in, and they will show signs of submission and willingness to follow the rules of the herd. And a certain manner of walking, but he sets out the steps how this communication among horses takes place. And it's like reading a manual of sign language, you know, the drawings of this move means that, and this gait means that. And I think he says there are about 150 motions that he has identified that communicate. And of course, they only communicate in specific situation. You can't just make that move and have it mean something all by itself out of nothing. But in their life together, in certain situations, they need to indicate certain things. And he, as a trainer, does the same thing. And if you watch any of his videos, it is absolutely astounding how he works with horses. So there is a sense in which he has written a grammar. It's a pedagogical grammar to show people what moves mean what in what situations. But he stresses the fact that, first of all, it's learned behavior, and that it goes for almost all horses. I mean, all horses that he knows in all breeds all over the world have the same motions, so that these motions, they have some connection to them, to how horses move in the real world, and they make it mean something. I mean, they're not arbitrary. They're learned. So it's not, he refuses, he says that it can't be some program. It's definitely learned behavior. But it is pretty much the same in all horses. And he's also studied wild deer, to see if that's, he believes that the same is there with deer, and that one may have. Now, I don't know, he hasn't written enough. He doesn't write theoretical treatises, so it's kind of hard to know how old to go. And that's what I'm working on anyway, to understand that. But they don't have the kind of flexibility that our mouth and tongue afford us. I mean, the human ability to speak and to make distinctions is really dependent on our physiology, the way our anatomy works. Talbot Taylor's work with apes is absolutely astounding too. They can't do sign language like American Sign Language. They tried to teach them that, but their hands, their bodies aren't coordinated in the way to do it. But they were trying to teach a young ape sign language, and they were talking all the while amongst themselves, and that ape had a baby. Well, that baby grew up in this whole environment as almost like a human child, and they had no idea that it was paying attention or learning anything. It never showed any interest in anything. Then they took the mother away one day, and the baby was left there with the researchers, Sue Savage Rumbaugh. And it understood English. But they were talking, it would do something to show that, it would go grab a banana and give it to them if they said they needed a banana or something like that. And they realized that it couldn't talk a word. It knew no sign language, but it could understand what they were saying and follow directions. Absolutely astounding. Well, Talbot Taylor's written quite a bit on this, and it's absolutely fascinating that this young monkey could understand English, could not speak, just like children. They learn to understand before they can actually speak. Now, the ape couldn't ever learn to speak because of its own mouth and facial, the anatomical problem. But the apes, that baby ape, two things that it could do that absolutely astounded me was it enjoyed make-believe games. So it would play make-believe games with these trainers, these Sue Savage Rumbaugh and her colleagues. The fact that an ape can engage in make-believe games, just, I was stunned. What that may mean for our understanding of animals. Do horses play make-believe games? I've watched foxes playing in the barn, and I am sure they have that kind of imaginative life too. But the other thing was Savage Rumbaugh and her crew played a trick on another one of the apes. And this little ape that understood English ran right to their symbol board where he can point to things to show what he means. And he said, "You're bad." Now, an ape can judge human behavior in terms of good and bad. Well, I leave it for you to think about. I mean, the day after I read that, I walked out in the barn and I was thinking to myself, would you guys say you're bad if you could? It really changed the way I interact with my animals, to just the thought that perhaps they're judging me the way I judge Chomsky and Donald Trump and all these. Are my cats and my sheep and my cattle looking at me and saying, "You're bad"? So this recent exploration of mine in the world of and of communication has profoundly affected my own behavior and the way I act around my animals.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question that I should be directing to myself, but let me pose it to you anyway. If you were to advise me on what a decolonial approach to animal communication with horses would look like, what would you say?
Well, I think Monty Roberts has pretty much done that, because his whole first, he learned to communicate with horses when he was 13-year-old boy. He went out to trap horses to sell to the rodeos, and he went out in the Nevada desert by himself and just watched the horses. And this is where he learned, where he realized that they were communicating. And he realized that their motions, that their body language, their gestures, their movements were significant for them. And he learned how to respond in the same fashion so that they would respond to him as one of the herd. Now, the thing was, all horse training that he's aware of, and he's looked through the history to try to find out how people trained horses throughout the history of the domestication of horses, that it's all been in order to dominate and control the horse. And it's violent. Horse training has always been violent. And for Monty Roberts, the whole point was work with the horses. Let's do things together. Let's have fun. And that's why, when I close my thing, he's not trying to dominate horses. He's not trying to bring them under his control. He's establishing a relationship very much like a marriage, where you choose to do things together, not separately, not against each other, not controlling each other, but say, yes, let's live a life together and do things because we enjoy each other's company. Now, if North and South, Englishmen and Zimbabwean, could live together with this agreement of, yes, let's work together, let's live together, let's manage a life that we both can enjoy. Well, that's, I think, the whole point of decolonial linguistics, is to get to that kind of conversation, that kind of linguistic interaction, rather than I'm the authority, you listen. Science says you have to believe, but to have a whole different kind of relationship. So I think that Roberts, by taking horse training away from control and domination and making it a joint activity, that's language at its best.
That's interesting. Yes, Sally, you wanted to jump in.
Yes, thank you. The question is a very good one. And thank you, David. You answered it very well. So I have very little to add to it now. What I was going to say is that we have been colonial toward animals and
exactly
imposing ourselves as superior to them. And as David just said by the end of his answer, we have to engage with them and realize that just like it is hard for them to speak or to sign, it's hard for us to learn that means of communication. How successful are we to figure out how horses communicate among themselves, how chimps communicate among themselves? Are we anatomically and mentally capable of doing what they do? And why do we expect them to do what we do?
Exactly. We cannot expect horses and apes to learn Shona or English, but that doesn't mean they won't communicate with us if we will just pay attention. But that is very, I mean, I am just blown away at what Monty Roberts was able to learn from horses. But he did it as a little boy who loved horses. That was the whole thing. He went out to capture horses, but he spent a month learning first. And that was the most important month of his life. And that time he says that, you know. So in fact, he sends out a flyer when you order his books or videos or whatever. And he has a picture of him with the two horses behind him. And he says, the caption on the flyer is "Meet the professors." He regards the horses as his professors, and he promotes the horses as the teachers. That is wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful.
Good. Yeah, Magda, I hand over back to you. I think Mari wants to say something.
Yes, that's right. We have a question from Mari, and Rafael also is paying attention to the chat.
Yeah, and Sangeeta, sorry, Mari, Sangeeta had written to me before saying that she wanted to make an intervention. So, but Sangeeta now.
I want to jump in, and your question is connected to this, so that's perfectly okay. I was probably going on a different direction, but I could come in. And first comment, thank you very much. First comment, this ongoing discussion on decoloniality of how we approach animals. I mean, in a number of world philosophies, Bade, you actually talk about them initially in your presentation. There isn't this hierarchy of humans at the pinnacle, but there is much more horizontal relationships. So everything from Ubuntu, how the Sami, relationships with nature, and a number of so-called indigenous communities, ways of being connects very much to what you're saying. And I'm wondering whether those, you would also include those in this decoloniality towards animals. But so you could comment on that. My question was, I was floored when you took up Tattvamasi, particularly because I use that in the introduction to a double special issue that comes out in a week or so, and where some colleagues on the screen have contributed. And I'd like you to comment that, because the way I have used it for a number of different reasons, I can read Devanagari, but my Sanskrit is very rusty. I use it together with Tattva Mimamsa, and both these two phrases, which are not completely unknown, but maybe in the Anglo-Saxon world, there is not much attention paid to these kind of concepts like Ubuntu. We don't, in European spaces, those are kind of modern, fashionable concepts, but not in depth. So what I do with the Tattvamasi, I think of it as a gloss that points to ontological, epistemological basis of who I am, who you are, who we are, who living things are. So, I mean, I'm thinking also in connection with Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen master who passed away last weekend, the way in which he elaborates on life, being, becoming, and continuing. So there is these kind of thinkings kind of bring home our naivety of understanding language in the way that you have explored something that I became aware of after leaving my doctoral studies in communication sciences, and then kind of tipping into what gets glossed as linguistics. So I don't have this background, but I've had to learn that in order to be able to teach, for instance. So Tattvamasi for me would be unlearning to learn in the way where you are also trying to say what you have had to unlearn in order to relearn, because what you were offered was not fitting into what you were seeing. And that is what I heard Sinfree, you also point out to, that the mosquitoes kind of helped you see that that is what you are learning is not connecting to the reality that you are in. So could you comment on Tattvamasi?
My encounter with that phrase goes back a long way, but I don't remember the origin. I remember I was reading the Bhagavad-Gita in the early 80s. At that time, I was particularly interested in Buddhism and studying Buddhism, but I read an essay about the Bhagavad-Gita and this phrase that I used, the one about therefore fight. It was what does Krishna mean? Is he arguing that war is okay? That, you know, I mean, it's a huge issue, and that was why I was reading it, because I couldn't understand it, and I was trying to understand it. And all I can say is I've spent the next 40 years thinking about it without ever coming to some definitive answer. I keep thinking about it. And the Tattvamasi was roughly at the same time to realize that I cannot set myself above others in judgment. That well, I don't know what to say more about it. I can just say that phrase has resounded with me throughout the years since. For 40 years, I live with it, and I don't know that I can offer any more explanation except that phrase comes to mind a lot of times. Partly in a sense of acknowledging my kinship with the world, but partly also to stop myself from that arrogant assumption that my judgments over against the world should not be turned around as self-judgments. In fact, I think when I read Nietzsche, my first thought after reading several of his works was that, you know, all of the nasty, cruel things he says about this, and the other probably are an admission of self-knowledge. He is blasting away all these people because he sees that as himself, and he cannot admit it. So the Tattvamasi for me is very much to keep me from ranting and raving like a Nietzsche and putting everybody else down, to acknowledge that we're in this together. We're a lot more alike than unalike, but our differences are real. But I guess it's a this again is a lifelong question for me. Is the nature of can we communicate? Can we actually meet each other? Is there possibility? I mean, there are so many intellectual currents that say, well, you can't. You're it's a prison house of language. You can't get out of it, or I can't remember the word, the name of it now. Constructionist epistemology, where everything is actually your own mental activity. You don't ever actually encounter the world. I mean, there are all sorts of things like this. And my own experience, quite simply, was that meeting a young Romanian woman in college changed me forever. Yeah, I mean, it's simple. It's just simple. I cannot say she was a product of my imagination, that she was just a linguistic fiction. She was real. The fact that she wasn't interested made it a real dilemma for me. But that is basically it. I've stumbled upon baby foxes playing in the barn, and will never forget the experience. It was, they didn't know I was there, and I walked in and they're playing, and it was out of this world experience for me. I will remember it on my deathbed. It was just incredible. Well, that's the real encounter. I mean, I lived in the real world, and so any theory that says that I don't live in the real world, I just reject. And the Tattvamasi was very much an important thing for me to recognize that we are together. We do share this world. We do experience things together, which doesn't mean that I understand everything that goes on in your mind, or that I understand everything you say, or that my knowledge is absolute and certain. I mean, philosophers argue about the certainty and all that, and I think it's just a silly argument. We live in a real world, and we love it or we reject it. But the more we love it, the more we know it. Sorry, that's not a very good answer to Tattvamasi, but
No, but thank you for sharing. Because, I think you make a point when you say it is about the relationships and not the, yeah. So it does make, and what you said earlier on, world shaking and world making of language in the real world. And I think that is also the essence of it, of the I, who I or who you or who we are, rather than that there is this essentialistic way of understanding. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sangeeta. Thank you, David. We have also now a question from Mari Haneda. Mari?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I really appreciate it, and I was nodding along. So I have two questions. I just wondered if you have encountered Hallidean linguistics, and if you felt any affinity toward it, because it sort of shares fundamental key premise was the integrationist linguistics. The second is a more personal one. I attended Theory of Mind conference at the University of Toronto that was organized by psychologist David Dawson. And so Harris's lecture was really excellent, but then there are just sort of numerous complaints by female keynote speakers and graduate students that Harris was an absolute pig, like he was real sexist. And David was really plagued with complaints that people wanted Harris to leave, huge number of women. And so this sort of like begs the question of like, the anti-racist and feminist people are saying right now, like, for example, at the University of Pennsylvania, they removed the name of, not Gumpert, but who's the other one?
Taylor Himes.
Okay. From the name of the center because of his mistreatment of graduate students, female graduate students, so forth. So my anti-racist or feminist colleague would say that I shouldn't be using either Bill Himes or John Gumpert's because of their personal behavior. So Harris really displayed really incredibly condescending behavior toward women, belittling us. And I just wondered if you consider like separating the printed word from the individual and appreciate the work, or, you know, are they integrated? I don't know. So if you could sort of like explore that two questions, I would be really grateful. Thank you.
Well, the first one is easy to answer. I've never read Halliday. When I left linguistics in 1979, I pretty much left it for good until I stumbled on Roy Harris in 2002. I didn't read linguistics, and I wasn't following linguistics at all. And since Harris, I've had too little time to explore things that I would. I have, I believe, 5 or 6 of Halliday's books on my shelf, but they remain unread like many other of my books. So I can't really say anything about Halliday. I don't have any opinions because I have absolutely no knowledge. As far as Harris, and Harris was, I only met Harris once. I visited him at his home in 2009 at a seminar he had for a number of younger, well, I shouldn't say younger, I certainly wasn't young, but it's people who had discovered his work since he'd retired was basically the people he had there. My own relationship with Harris was always positive. He was very, very a wonderful support to me. Since I'm not a woman, I cannot really comment about his attitude towards women. I do know Harris, from all accounts, was very difficult to get along with, even amongst those of his admirers. As far as rejecting a thinker because of their attitudes or beliefs, that's a really hard one, because I think we would all be rejected. I don't know of any academics who could set themselves up as a model. We listen to each other, and we try to learn from each other, and we criticize each other. So I dislike, I will give one example. In my youth, I was very much interested in Paul Goodman, the anarchist theorist. Well, Goodman was kicked out of every job he had for sexually harassing his students, male and female. Goodman was absolutely appalling in his personal attitudes and behaviors. But I found a lot of what he wrote to be very, very interesting. Now, it was a dilemma for me for years, because I was inspired by his writing. I was absolutely appalled at his behavior. Now, I find Harris's writing, his ideas, his questions, the orientation of his research to be absolutely marvelous. Nothing like it. I really appreciate Harris. That he was hard to get along with, that he had some pathological issues in dealing with people. For instance, he never wrote about other people's writings with praise unless they were his students. Well, that's a problem. That is a real problem. Now, in private communication, he admitted to me that he had been influenced by Hume, and that he really thought R.G. Collingwood was greatly underrated. Now, that correspondence followed my own acknowledgement that I was profoundly influenced by Collingwood and by Hume. So he was responding to something I had written. But Harris had some serious problems as a human being. I don't think anyone who knew him would deny that. I find his attitude towards language and our political responsibilities towards each other to be very amenable to a feminist approach. Now, that feminists would reject Harris and his ideas and attitudes, I'm in no position to say that. I mean, to make judgments on that. If I can go apart from Harris a minute, one of my other big major influences is Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy. He is totally marginal character. If anyone read that paper I wrote, you'll get some idea. Now, what is not in that paper is one of the most extraordinary things that made me keep at trying to understand Rosenstock-Huessy. Rosenstock-Huessy once wrote somewhere, and I don't know where, can't remember, that the most important issue for human beings, all of us, always, is that men and women should somehow find a way to live a life together that they can both say yes to. He says this is more important than religion, than science, than politics, it is the fundamental issue that we face, and we should be prepared to jettison everything else to meet that need of ours, because there is no human future without our learning to make a world in which both of us, men and women, can live together and embrace the world we make together. Now that, to me, is the most profound feminist orientation that I have ever read, because it is not just for boys or just for girls. It is an orientation and a foundational assumption about life. No one would ever call Rosenstock-Huessy a feminist. And Rosenstock-Huessy wrote a lot of things that would offend a lot of people. And if you're a feminist, you probably shouldn't read Rosenstock-Huessy. If you're a Marxist, you probably shouldn't read Rosenstock-Huessy. He was heretical in everything that he wrote, but he began on that assumption. And that, that's all I can say, is that was his primary objective in trying to fashion a world with language and communication that men and women can both say yes to. Now, one can reject Rosenstock-Huessy for many things that he said and wrote, and one can reject him for his attitudes towards horses or women. I don't know. He was dead before I ever went to college, so I never met him. I have no experience. I know from his writings that he's incredibly difficult for people to handle. But I find those kind of things in his writing, and I'm grateful. I don't find that anywhere else. Now, Harris, I think, is in probably the same boat as Rosenstock-Huessy. Rosenstock-Huessy criticized everybody, so did Roy Harris. But they each of them had something to offer us. And I would hate to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's sort of the position I've been taking, despite criticism from my staunch feminist friends, because otherwise you erase people, you erase the history of intellectual history of a particular discipline, and that's like erasing the history of linguistics before Chomsky, right? So we'll be making that mistake. So thank you for that response. And I think Sangeeta has a follow-up question on mine, right? Thank you.
Should I just jump in? I just wanted to comment, and this is a question I ask myself. When I started working with language studies, what I prefer to call linguistics, of course you can't then, and this is in my postdoc career, you can't then avoid John Gumpertz. Having known and done fieldwork during my doctoral studies in Mumbai, Pune, and Delhi, I was a bit puzzled to see John Humpert's work never giving any recognition to scholars or interpreters or whoever in the Indian landscape. And slowly it dawned on me that I don't know, I couldn't make sense of what he was saying in terms of, I couldn't relate to the theorizing he was doing, and unconsciously I refused to reference him. And this is where my question comes. This is long before, I mean, what has now happened with Delheims and what is happening with Roads Must Fall Now and all those movements. This is much, 2 decades ago. So my question is that if we have scholars who are saying the same things as scholars we happen to have met and who don't meet up to a moral yardstick, call it what you may, is it relevant that we pay them homage in our referencing? So this is a question I ask myself and I ask others. And Murray, what you are now raising, I had no idea. Sinfrey needs to be acknowledged because he brought Joy Harris into my life. I had no idea about him until a couple of years ago. And I relate to Roy Harris's works. I think I bought 10 of his volumes, and each, whatever I put my fingers into, I relate to them. And that's because of the kind of theorizing I met as a doctoral student in the 80s and the 90s. So I don't know anything about Roy Harris's personal life, but I'd like to understand a general principle understanding. Is it just the history of a particular area that we are reproducing? Don't we then become complicit ourselves? So I think what Murray is raising goes beyond just this particular person. And I can take up some other references in other fields, in the field of democracy, where my colleagues in Sweden pay homage to perpetrators in the Nazi regime, because they have happened to have written fantastic philosophical texts. And I find it very hard to reference them when other people who I happen to have also read say exactly the same things. So I just want to make that point. It is, why take that particular road when others have said,
May I just jump in? I just wanted to reinstate what I said. So pay homage to the history of discipline, but with an eye of, like caveat. So you have to make an effort of, like that John Gumpert's seminal work in India is now pronounced as a manifestation of colonial project that we shouldn't follow. So it's not really reproducing, but studying it with critical eye. So there's a difference of just tracing, but with sort of like what we can learn and what we probably shouldn't do, so it's not really as docile, submissive tracing that I'm advocating or ignoring a problematic, underlying, I don't know, issues that surrounds that individual, but we shouldn't circumvent that. We should really confront it. I just wanted to follow up on it. Sorry. I'll close my mouth.
Thank you for your interventions, Mari and Sangeeta. There are more people who'd like to ask questions or make comments. I see here on my list, there is Salukoko Mofene, and then Ashraf, Magda, and there is a new one just posted now. I have to figure out whether it's a comment or a question still, but while I do that, Salukoko, if you would like to make your comment or ask your question, please.
Yes, it's mostly a comment. Well, a few comments. David, I'm very grateful that you accepted Siegfried's invitation to speak to us. The presentation has been powerful, well articulated, well put together, and really on target for everything that you said. I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Chicago, and it's a shame that we never met.
I was going to say, I saw your name, and I even got a mass email from you once, but I never met you.
Yes, and so I'd like to point out that linguistics has its roots in the colonial enterprise. And it's probably not by accident that the roots of linguistics lie in genetic linguistics. And incidentally, when Sir William Jones hypothesized that Hindic languages were related to European languages, hence the Indo-European language family, people reacted negatively to that hypothesis because they said Indians are inferior to us. Europeans, I mean, when by people I meant European scholars, said Indians are inferior to us. There is no way that the languages they speak can be related to Latin, to Greek, and the like, which were put on the top of the pedestal of the scale. And then you get people like Schlegel trying to rank languages in terms of the complexity of the structures and so forth, and putting European languages at the top of the scale and non-European languages, either Chinese or African languages or Native American languages at the bottom of the scale. And later on, when linguistics in America developed, and there is an interesting book, I don't know if you can read the title there, that was published recently.
Native Tongues, yeah.
Native Tongues by Sean Harvey in 2018. And it shows to what extent the American government sponsored linguistics for the purpose of determining how primitive Native American languages were, and to justify why they should be confiscating land from Native Americans and push them to reservations and so forth. And when you put it in the big picture, you also realize that linguists in the early 20th century, wanted to find out how different non-European languages were in relation to European languages. But along with that, when you put things in perspective, it's teaching non-Europeans to study non-European languages from the perspective of European languages, and not do things the other way around. To what extent what we learn about non-European languages should help us, should probably prompt us to question some of the established approaches or some of the established interpretations of how languages work. And that is something that I believe remains in linguistics up to this day, that it is too Western-centric and leaving very little room for non-Western perspectives to influence the evolution of the development of linguistics. And that is very serious. In the same way that some Europeans complain that linguistics is too Americanocentric or Anglo-centric. A number of us non-Europeans complain that linguistics is really too Western-centric. And for people like me that have published extensively, people can say, how can you complain? You have made it. Well, I complain because I struggle every time for every publication to convince reviewers there is something you are missing. There is an alternative way of looking at things and so forth. And that isn't happening fast enough in linguistics. You know, yes, linguistics has emancipated somewhat from that colonial tradition, but in my mind, not really enough and not fast enough, and things can really move faster and evolve for the better. You mentioned Robert Lee. I met him, and I'm grateful I met him because he taught me to, I didn't take classes with him, but in formal settings, he taught me to question what I was reading about generative grammar and the like. And I'm fortunate that at the University of Chicago, where I was trained by people like Jim McCauley, I was really encouraged to think independently out of the box. And that has helped me. Braj Castro is also very important in that particular context and so forth. And I think I will close by saying, thank God all white linguists don't fit the mold that, you know, of generative linguistics, and not all generative linguists really follow Chomsky closely. But you were right on target when you put your finger on universal grammar. It doesn't help us deal with linguistic diversity, you know.
Least of all, a universal grammar based solely on English.
That's right. That's right. And that's where you find a lot of colonialism, because especially when you are non-European and you question the value of universal grammar and so forth, it's very hard to be published. But what's wrong with universal grammar is that it doesn't, well, part of what is wrong is that it doesn't tell you what real universal they are. And those putative universals, are there consequences of the way the mind works? Because some of those principles, you can find them out of language. Or are there consequences of the materials that languages are made with? Okay, and things like that. So there is, I'm glad, really very grateful you gave this presentation, because it gives a lot of food for thought. Can I ask you, is your email still a University of Chicago address?
No, I had to give that up when I left, yes.
Okay, so I'd like to be able to get in contact with you, because we have plenty of things.
Sinfrey has my email. He can probably send it directly to you, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
What I'll do, Sally, is I will forward you his email address. I will forward you David's email address.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, what I'm saying is that I will give Sally David's email address.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, everyone. Yes, David?
I would like to back up just a minute to the Mari Haneda and Sangeeta's comments, and the issue of how to listen to and acknowledge people who were not in their personal lives have attitudes and ideas that we can agree with. That's a major issue. That's a big issue, and you know that goes back a long way. Political correctness movement in the United States in the 80s and 70s. I don't know how far back, but I'm inclined to not want to read people whose lives, as it is known to me, offend me. But at the same time, I have had experiences where I would like to just relate one such experience, which kind of stops me in my tracks whenever I dismiss a thinker. Namely, when I was in graduate school, and this would have been 1978 or 79, right before I left. I was terribly brokenhearted because a certain woman that I was madly in love with married somebody else, and that really left me in quite a state of turmoil. I was terribly depressed, and I went and I talked to a fellow linguistics student. Now, he was, in fact, kind of a renegade and ostracized in the department, and I enjoyed associating with outcasts. But in fact, he was one of the nastiest, meanest, vicious intellectuals I have ever met, and never had a career. And I don't know what else I should say, except that he ranks at the top of people I would not want to associate with since. I did it as a foolish young student because he was a bad boy. But I told him about my unhappiness, and that I had even thought about killing myself. I was so unhappy. And he looked at me, snarled, as just completely contemptuous, and said, "If you really loved her, you should make her proud of you." And then he stalked off, and I didn't see him for years. In fact, that was the conversation that saved my life, turned me completely around. And it was the meanest, wickedest, stupidest, nastiest pseudo-intellectual I've ever met. Now, what has that to do with Roy Harris and John Gumperz? Perhaps a lot. But I always remember that when I get ready to dismiss someone for being, not having the right political attitude, for being a feminist or not feminist or whatever it may be. I remember that conversation, that he had the right word that I needed to hear at the right time. And that's all I can say. Roy Harris spoke to me really powerfully. And Heidegger I've never read because I just couldn't get over his attitudes, but probably I should read him. But there you have it. There are people we don't read for many reasons, and there are people that we do read and learn from. But definitely, if we don't read someone, we're never going to learn from them.
Thank you very much, David. Unfortunately, we're reaching the end of the formal session of our conversation today. So I will hand over to Makoni for his final considerations before we move on to the after party.
Yeah, I think the thing to think about now is just to move on to the after party, because there are a lot of people who still want to intervene. Anissa wants to say something. Ashraf, I've seen, and a couple of other people. Anissa, you wanted to comment. You are muted. Anissa, you are muted.
Yes.
Okay.
Just mastering technology. Thank you, ma'am. First of all, I can't thank you enough. This was just music to me. So many golden threads for us all to go away with. Now, I've been looking for someone like you to listen to. I think you're at the hub of what our forum is about. Listen to everyone.
Well, I was trying to write for the forum.
That was not wise. Well, there are so many things I would like to share with you and with everyone, but I see that the main thing here is superiority is the enemy of trust. Exactly. Whether it's between male, female, animal, human, tree, insect, nations. So that is the enemy of trust. Now, to me, I would say that when I studied linguistics, I went with high hopes, and most of my hopes were met. But on the syllabus, there was a lot of emphasis on syntax, grammar, this, that, and the other. but there was no platform for trust, because language is about communication, and linguistics is all to do with language, but there's nothing on trust there. And when I spoke to some of my lecturers about, Sinfree knows I love them all, and they were wonderful people doing an excellent job. But I had spent time with the pygmies in the Aturi forest, and I spoke to my lecturers about my experience there of how these people, the pygmies that I grew to trust, they trusted me, and they could communicate with animals. And I was told the only communication that we can recognize is the bees and the bee dance. So I kept all the knowledge that I really valued, that I learned at the university regarding linguistics, and I went on to study multiple intelligences, starting with Howard Gardner in the 80s. And there was a lack of spiritual intelligence. But I see now from what I'm hearing here that we're all sort of coming together. And the greatest ecological disaster is the lack of trust. And that comes with the spiritual intelligence of being. I mean, if you look at all the people, if we want to understand animals, maybe we should also understand the people who do understand animals. Now, I want to share one brief story here that I had a friend, a shepherd. When I moved to the Highlands, he was one of my first friends, and he had, in a car accident, lost half of his brain. And he became a shepherd, and he had total communication with sheep. And I'm surrounded with sheep here. And he taught me so much about how to communicate with sheep. So it's all about trust. And thank you so much, because you brought so much trust here and you moved us all. Thank you.
There's Talbot Taylor published a few years ago an essay on oh man, I'm forgetting. It was a Meredith Williams a book about Wittgenstein. It is a marvelous piece where the issue that comes to the fore is that trust is essential for children to be able to learn language. They can't go at it with the intellectual's critical, dissecting, analytical attitude. They have to believe that you're speaking to them and that you have something to say and that their response matters. And it's a profound essay. I wish I had the title of it on my top, but it's by Talbot Taylor, and it's about Meredith Williams' book on Wittgenstein. But the basic part is how much children have to have a world of trust, or they cannot learn language. I think you would really. I was really impressed with the essay. I mean, so much so that I'm going to have to read Meredith Williams, if not Wittgenstein.
Yeah, Wittgenstein is amazing there. But the thing is, for all relationships, trust is required. You cannot have mind marriages without trust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if superiority comes into it, there's very little trust. As soon as superiority walks in, trust dies.
Well, as soon as Hobbes' attitude that knowledge is power orients our learning, then we have already decided that the knowledge that enables domination is the only knowledge that is knowledge. I reject that completely. I think the only way to know your children or your sheep is to be madly in love with them and wish them their own life, not a life that follows my desires and my demands, but something which will allow them, as Rosenstock-Huessy said, in male-female relationships, it's got to be a world that we can each say yes to, which means we each have to be a part of making it.
Mm-hmm. Trust and understanding. We should also look at Spinoza.
Well, I haven't read him either. I'm sorry.
You would enjoy that.
I've only lived 63 years. can't read everything.
Okay. Raphael, you said Ashraf had a question that he wanted answered. Ashraf,
Yeah.
what is the question?
He wrote it in the chat. Yes.
Yeah, it's actually I first I should say thank you to David for the interesting presentation. I heard you once, Sinfa, I heard you once talk about or make an argument that we need to consider human language as part of the animal language. As strategic way of combating the social Darwinist conception of African languages as pre-modern. I heard you arguing.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I think what I was trying to say was that if you think of human language as part of animal language, it liberates you to it enables you to see more about what animal languages may provide and how that may enrich your own understanding of what constitutes human language. But if you think of animal language as completely separate from human language, you may then tend to fall into the trap of thinking of animal language as being inferior to human language. But if you think that human language is part of animal language, and that the distinctions between us and animals really are inconsequential, you are liberated to see more things than you would do if you saw the two as completely different. This, to some extent, goes back to the point that Sangeeta was making, that it's not, the distinctions between animals and humans is not consistent across the globe. In some cases, animals and humans intermingled and they're seen as part. We are all part of the same species, right? That's what I think I was trying to get at, that we need to reverse this whole thing. It ties to what Sally was saying, that the critical issue, the critical question to pose is, what would English, French, Spanish look like if they were to be analyzed and framed from the perspective of African languages? What is it that the analysts who study English would learn about English if they looked at the world starting off from the perspective of African languages, Arabic, etc., or Native American languages? That, I think, is an interesting question to pose, even for this specialists in English, that they can never have a comprehensive analysis of English unless they see how English looks like from the perspective of African languages, Native American languages, Indigenous American languages, because that they don't, that perspective is not there.
Ashraf, while you're still here, let me just say I really enjoyed your essays that I happened to read while editing Sinfri's book. You've got a wonderful topic and written quite a few really nice things. I was really happy to read your works. Thank you.
Thank you. And David, the part of all your work that I like best is the one that you captured, that when you said that you remember this Romanian girl who has had such an impact on you, even though she said no, and that linguists are bad at falling in love. I thought that was the most articulate statement I've ever heard about linguists. Mark, did you agree? Right. Okay. Any other questions? Oh, yeah. Okay. Sally says that he recommends the following book that connects human languages to animal communication, From Sign to Symbol, by Ron Plena and Kim Stranley. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks. Vishna, you came in late. Do you have any questions?
I had a question.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I had the last question very briefly before we finish, David. I just wanted to know your take on something that for me seems to be a contradiction, which is building this kind of horizontal communication between all living beings, decentering our superiority as human species, building trust. And at the same time, the nutritional science is so centered on our needs, and we keep eating animals. So I wanted to understand, what is your take on this?
Well, my cats eat the mice, and I'm grateful for that. No, honey.
It's nice.
The coyotes eat my sheep. I'm not grateful for that. The raccoons come in, and they only want to eat the buttocks and the nose, the soft parts of a lamb when it's brand new born. I think anyone who lives with animals know that animals eat animals. And I think some of you may know of Temple Grandin. She designs slaughterhouses. She's autistic. She's absolutely brilliant. She loves her animals, and that's why she wants a slaughterhouse that doesn't scare them or give them bad feelings. But she says it's very simple, that there wouldn't be sheep, cattle, and goats if they weren't domesticated now. They do not have the biological characteristics that enabled them to survive in the wild. We've bred it out of them. If we stop eating them, there will be no more sheep. I can say that for sure. If it's a world of coyotes and sheep, there will be no sheep. So I acknowledge that coyotes eat sheep, that cats eat mice, and that I like bacon. It's just now I can't butcher. I've been unable to do that, and raising sheep and spending my life with sheep, cattle, goats, whatever. It's very hard to take them to slaughter. It's very hard for me. But do I get rid of them? Then what? I have 50 acres of bottomland where they love living. They have a beautiful life. And the girls till they die. The boys, they go to a Muslim feast or a Greek Orthodox Easter celebration. I do not know that I can improve on nature. I mean, what am I saying? Of course I can't improve on nature, but as far as whether I will eat meat or not eat meat, I think coyotes and cats don't ask those questions, and humans do. And how human beings answer those questions, I feel they should follow their conscience. So maybe someday I will stop eating meat. Right now, I really enjoy it. But I have no objections to people who are vegans or vegetarians. I don't. My mother won't eat any of the meat that is declared unclean in the Old Testament. Now, that's why I don't cook bacon in her house. I do that here. But people's attitudes as to what they should eat, what they should not eat, I will leave that up to each person. And when it comes, if I meet a cannibal, I'm going to run.
Okay.
Thank you for your answer, David.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay.
Dr.
let's get-
Marconi, I just
Yes.
have a follow-up question, like a follow-up comment, very hopefully brief follow-up comment.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, and so your comment actually inspired me as I was thinking through all of these issues. And I think a lot of these questions are coming up of how to make like more horizontal, critical practice, thinking about things critically and from a decolonial perspective. And I was thinking also of Dr. Bates' comment about how we should find a world in which both men and women can live with, and just taking that, maybe even extending that to think of how can we not just find a world in which men and women can live with, but how can we look at, like Dr. Makoni, you said, looking at European languages from the perspective of African languages. So how can we look at the world from the perspective of female scholars? How can we look at the world from the perspective of African scholars, like through those lenses, and not just, agreeing to disagree on certain things, but how can we actually start looking at the world through those lenses, if that makes sense?
Well, first of all, I think I have to listen to you if I want to know what a woman thinks. I'm not going to figure that out myself. And as far as African scholars, it's why I read Ashraf Abdul-Hai and Symphony Makoni. My own delight in discovering my world in the library was that all of those voices can come together. No one was excluded. That's why I could work in a library much more happily than I could stand in front of a classroom and tell people what I thought was what. I was very, very uncomfortable in that role and never will be. And when Simfrey asked me to talk here, I told him, Simfrey, I really, what is a white boy from Central Illinois? I got to talk to an Africa forum. What am I, But in fact, it is the conversation that we need. And it's a conversation we need, not me giving people the voice of science. I refuse to speak in the name of science. I speak as somebody who's interested in what all of you have to say. And I think that multi-perspective conversation is the only way we'll get beyond that narrow-minded view of the English-only America, science. I mean, every adjective you put on there, English, America, science, you just narrow the world so far down that all you've got left is knowledge is power, and a world that you're destroying. I want knowledge that is more of well, as I would put it, I think it's impossible to have justice without love. I don't think it's impossible to know the world if you hate it. If you love the world, it can affect you. It can change your life. If you hate the world, all you can do is kill it. That's it. As I mentioned, the experience of falling in love as a teenager, as a college boy, was profoundly oriented my attitude towards theory. And it was because she was real. She was not a fantasy. She was not a theory. She wasn't just something I'd been told about. And for the rest of my life, I've sought to meet the world in that fashion. To appreciate it, to know it, to love it for what it is, not for what I wish it would be. And that, did you ever
meet that woman again?
Do I what?
Did you ever meet this woman who turned you down?
No, I left her alone because I thought it would make her happiest.
Okay.
No, really, if you're a woman and some crazy guy in love is after you, it could be horrible. I'm sure it was something she worried about, I mean, women have to deal with stalkers and all sorts of crazy things. I don't want her to think I'm
one of them.
But
okay.
I've never forgotten her, that's for sure. I mean, but I leave her alone because I think that's what is best for her.
Okay. Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Kim and Vishna, who is going to tell us about the next